Okay, good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Corey and I'm with Interfaith Works. Welcome to Lean in Olympia. This is a bi-weekly show airing on the second and fourth Tuesdays of every month. And this show is a show that explores conversations at the crossroads of humanity, justice, and belief. If you want to check out past episodes or stay up to date on what we're doing at Interfaith Works, please check out our website at interfaith-works.org. And check out our Interfaith Works Facebook page and YouTube channel. Again, my name is Corey. I'm a program director for Interfaith Relations with Interfaith Works, and it is my joy to welcome Sarah Lloyd today as our guest.
Thank you.
Dr. Sarah Lloyd.
Yep.
Yeah.
Dr. Sarah Lloyd. I mean, it's preemptive, doctor, but still, claim it, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
2023 is your
2023.
is graduating from St. Martin's, the degree in, again?
Leadership and Social Justice.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah, so
Right on.
good.
Yeah.
I have wanted a PhD since I was 5 years old.
You mentioned that yesterday, and I was amazed. I didn't doubt it, but I'm amazed. Like, that's such a specific. Where did you come to know what that was and that you wanted it at 5 years old?
I don't remember where I learned about it, but I remember school just being my jam and me wanting to learn all the things. I have an older sister who's 4 years older than me, and she would like make me play school and stuff. So I went into kindergarten like a boss, you know? So I just always have been very driven, very focused, and very like laser point clear on exactly what I wanted. Yeah.
Were you trying to like out school perform your sister a little bit or something?
No, because all the shade but no shade. Like my sister didn't love school, so she didn't do great in it. It was more like in my family of five, we each kind of had our jam, and I had no jam, but what was left was school. And so I was like, yep. So luckily it worked out.
still giving you energy, and you're on track for PhD in just a couple of years. That's great.
Yeah,
Congrats.
absolutely. Thank you.
Congrats.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to try to list some of the things that you do, which won't capture all of them because it would take all of our time.
Yep.
But, and then some of these we'll unpack a little bit more too, including maybe if we get to it, how you have navigated your experience moving through an institution like St. Martin's.
Yeah.
I find that fascinating with your work as an equity coach. So you name yourself as the principal disruptor of Soul on Fire Consulting, and I would love to unpack that later in our conversation. And from your website, it talks about Soul on Fire being an equity-centered coaching for leaders and organizations to create dynamic spaces that challenge and support growth. And you are on the board of directors for the YMCA. I
am.
Yeah, and vice chair of the Social Justice and Equity Committee on that board. And you're also on the board of directors for Career Path Services. You're in a PhD program at St. Martin's. You're the mother of 3 beautiful girls. Yep. And you do a podcast called Zero Apologies, Dropping Truths.
I do.
Yeah.
Yep.
And do you sleep every once in a while? Or?
I mean, every third or fourth day. No, I totally sleep. Absolutely. I just power pack my minutes when I'm awake.
Of those things I listed, which would you pick to want to talk about to help us get to know you a little bit more?
Sure. Well, I think Soul on Fire embodies a lot of what branches into the other things. So for me, Soul on Fire was an opportunity for me to show up in leadership differently. I've had a lot of different experiences at a lot of different institutions all across the country. And so what I've gained from that experience is a real perspective about different leaders doing things differently and what works and what doesn't work. And, sometimes we learn better from terrible leaders or terrible leadership opportunities. And so I've had this breadth of a lot of different people winning and losing and how they handled it and how they managed it and what that looked like. And so I've always been gifted with this very broad, meaningful and tethered experience in what it means to show up in leadership. And so it's a blessing and a curse, right? Because then you go into spaces and you have the capacity and the ability to shift and move. And it's even more painfully aware when things are falling short. And so what I recognize is that perspective, along with the practical applications of, I've worked in K-20 education, I've worked in workforce development, I've worked in human services. And so all of those things come together to this like very unique and applicable in any situation kind of perspective that can help people lead at capacity and help organizations really tap into their most powerful leaders, which sometimes situationally is not someone who holds a title, right? And so it's important if we really want to move forward in the ways that we say we want to move forward, we have to be willing to question everything that we do. And so I'm walking organizations and individuals through that.
Okay. I'm curious too, if you could, we talked yesterday about mentors.
Yeah.
And you mentioned your sister, and now we're starting to get a feel for your work.
Yeah.
But were there people in your life that you can look back on now that you've had this breadth of experience across organizations and say, this person helped me to see in a way to bring me toward a vision of this work that I'm doing?
Yeah.
Or who might you list that inspired you to endure some of those hard spaces and to keep at this work that you're doing?
Sure. To be honest, so after you asked me that yesterday, I was like, let me think about that. And I have a couple, but in general, my experience has been void of that. And I've watched mentorship manifest such powerful things in other people's lives. And I've interfaced with this system that inherently doesn't believe in my capacity, both as a woman and then as a Black woman, to show up in spaces and actually be able to lead without doing damage. And so because of that, I think it has manifested in these ways where people either assume that I'm good because I've survived this long, or don't invest because they're not sure that it's worth the money and time and resource. And so throughout my career, it's not that I'm self-made, because I deeply believe in the power of the collective, and I do think I've been self-taught in a lot of different ways. That said, I think later in my career, the last 5 or so years, I've had some really powerful individuals show up, and not necessarily enter as a mentor, but really just walk out what leadership means. Cheryl Fambles is one. She's at Pack Mountain, and she is dope. And her leadership is such a legacy of what it means to hold power, but hold it with grace. So there are lessons I've learned from her infinitely, and we've built a really strong relationship. I work with Kyle Cronk now, and his leadership is not necessarily accessible to me as a Black woman. And there are some really powerful lessons that he's teaching just in how he shows up in spaces. So I've been blessed to watch a lot of powerful people lead. And I've watched mentorship manifest in other people's experiences.
Yeah. One of the ways I personally think about mentorship too is not even necessarily just among the living, but ancestors as well.
Absolutely.
And when you hear me open that possibility to you, what do you think or feel when you hear about the possibility of ancestry being an influence and a vision or even a strength towards the work that you're doing?
Well, I think you have to acknowledge who's come before you, right? And that's a huge part of the collective. So when I talk about the collective, I'm also talking about historically throughout time. One of the challenges of being a Black person in the U.S. is that you don't necessarily have the ties to the specificity of your ancestor story. And there's a collective experience of what it means to have navigated life previous to now as a Black person. My mom was white, so there's some European heritage in there also, which is well documented and I learned all about in school. But there's this also this inherent humanity struggle that's what happens at the intersection of Blackness and white supremacy. And that part, I'll read things all the time where I'm like, oh my gosh, that was exactly the thought I had. And it will be something written by Frederick Douglass, right? And so there are some really powerful elements of the pieces of history we do have that I see myself in all the time. And I think it's really powerful to start earlier with that experience so that, I'm learning about different powerful Black folks now when I'm 40. And it's what would have happened in the trajectory of my leadership if that was brought to me in elementary school, right? And so there's a real ownership and furthering of the legacy that I take a lot of responsibility for, both in raising my own children and then showing up in the community.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, of course.
I don't know if this is an apt parallel, but there is something that happens, I think, in a lot of folk through a cultural erasure in white identity as well too. There's a lot for example, ancestry is a power that's really not fostered in modern white culture as a resource as much as I personally wish it was, and I've done some personal work to try to claim that and find that strength myself, and that's something that I mourn. There's a little bit of pre-immigrant just sort of closure on culture, and then just like a centralization of like the American experience of whiteness that I've started to identify as a kind of poverty in white culture.
Yeah, I think a major premise of how the U.S. works so air quotes well is that there is an admonition of all things except American, and so then it becomes like there's whiteness, and then there's like the people who aren't white, and then we talk about their land of origin and all of that. But you're right, there's this like, and that, or you're white, and you're here and you're white and you speak English, so like we're good. And so I think there's this deep accountability that people have to their culture when you are othered inside of the centering of whiteness. And I think, to your point, I think we all lose something when we don't understand the full story. And what does it mean for you not to have to know the full story in order to like justify your existence as a human being? And so I think there's a two-sided coin in that for sure.
Yeah. I want to hold that aspiration open just in my own life to deepen that connection beyond just the America feeling. And also I love what you were saying earlier. You present this concept of when you say community, you were already holding a concept of ancestors. When you were talking about community, you were holding history, you were holding current mentorships, and I saw that in your answer. Yeah,
there's this principle in the Nation of Islam where there's like 7 generations backwards and 7 generations forwards. And so you're always managing that 15 generations at one time. And so you're like sitting here now, but saying like, what have I been provided as the process to get to here and now? And then what does it look like, not just for my babies, but like for generations to come. And so if I have that kind of ownership and stewardship as I'm walking in spaces, then there's a whole different perspective about what it means to be successful, what it means to do right by people. All of that is so different when it's no longer transactional, and it really is thinking about systems and big picture perspective about like this single choice I make right now will have implications for years to come. So there's a different kind of like ownership and tethering that comes from that space for sure.
Because this word transactional, like a lot of organizations are founded on how, and your word successfully, how successfully are we transacting our either mission, which might even become, just even inundated with like the sense of capitalist, how strong is our mission? How well are we implementing it in terms of an outcome piece? So I'm curious for you, like when you enter into an organization, what are some of the initial like dynamics that you look at inside of the organization and start assessing, when you enter those spaces?
Sure. Well, I've been gifted with what my friends and I call the 10-second interview. And what that is like I walk into a space and I can see people fully and clearly. I'm not talking about like judgmental people, because people might be like, I can do that too. I'm talking about like I can see them so fully, and not potential. I think potential is BS. It's really about like, who are they fully, even if they haven't unlocked that entirely. And the same with environment. So I go in and just kind of like sit, and I pick up a lot from that like first minute. Then what I pay attention to is the dynamics, what questions they're willing to ask, what questions they aren't, what are some of the like assumptions that they have as they navigate the room. You can notice in a dynamic who has the most power in a situation, and then what do people do in response to that power? Are they reverent or are they resentful? Like, so there's all these different dynamics you can get by just watching. And then from that space, I'll ask questions, and I am a heavy hitter. I pull 0 punches. I have no apologies for that. So most people who sign up for that experience, like what we call the Sarah experience, right? They already know that there will be discomfort. They know that there will be pushing of boundaries. They know that there will be leaps. And so I go right into that of like, okay, so what's at center of that? Like you just made a decision. What's at the center of that? Let's have a real conversation about it, because you might be doing DEI work, for instance, but centering whiteness. So like, how do we grapple with and sit with and just let it be and normalize what it means to really question how we move through this world? Because if we're not willing to look at every single thing, then we can't make change, right? You're remodeling a condemned house instead of leveling it and starting again. So, I sense a lot of things, and then I'm willing to ask a lot of questions.
So yesterday you and I talked on the phone a little bit, and one of the metaphors that we were playing around with is like a recipe. Like when you come into an organization, there's certain things you need in a recipe or else it's just not going to work, like core ingredients. When you come into an organization and you do the assessment that you're talking about, and you're reading the room, you're sensing, what do you feel is required elements or ingredients in an organization for you to feel like there might be a chance for transformation or change at some level, like some basic ingredients, you know? Yeah.
Well, I think, recipes, I'm not much of a cook.
Actually, me neither, so.
Good, get it.
Okay.
But what I was thinking about is a roster. Like if I'm managing the Golden State Warriors, okay? And I'm like, okay, we lost some people are free agents, we're not obligated to some people, but we need to have the standards, right? Like you have to have that solid group. And the bench also needs to be mighty, right? So you need a Steph Curry, right? Like you have to have someone in that organization who is willing to lead it. And it doesn't necessarily look like a title, but it does look like power and authority, right? And so sometimes people do this work and they're like, if the CEO isn't on board, then we cannot move. And I don't think that's true, because sometimes you have figureheads who are just kind of there and they're like signing checks. And then other times you have people who like, they speak and everyone is like, right? And so I think you have to have that person who can drive it. You also have to have some real accountability, just in general. So one of the things that I have with organizations when I'm deciding whether or not to work with them is, do they have a solid recognition and accountability structure already? Because if not, imagine I come into Interfaith Works, for instance, right? And I'm like, okay, so we're doing this. And people are like, I'm not doing that. And if now you as an organization have to introduce both, we care about social justice and we're going to hold you accountable, then there's a lot of change for people to manage, and they can distract themselves and you as a leader talking about like, why are you being so harsh? Why am I getting documented? I haven't been documented in 12 years. Like, what is this about? And now we're having a conversation about accountability structures instead of the actual work, right? And people can bypass artfully in that space. And so it's really important. Like, do they have a community that holds each other accountable? Where does accountability come from? Is it top down or is it lateral as well, right? So all of these different pieces are critical. And then I also think you have to have the ability to do hard shit together. And if you can't do that, then you can't do this work. There are organizations everywhere that center white comfort to different levels. Some of the organizations, though, are paralyzed by it. And those are the organizations where, you raise something like, hey, who forgot to lock the door last night? And then everyone's like, oh, God, are we going to get fired? And so, like, nothing ever challenging happens. And it's just like in a romantic relationship, if you can't have arguments respectfully, obviously honoring people, yes, but being like, you messed up and this is what it looks like to fix that. If you can't do that in an organization, then you're definitely not going to do the work it takes to start centering equity.
And I'm going back one of those to the accountability piece and having those mechanisms of accountability in an organization. I was just thinking about you entering into an organization that might not have those, and how almost, I don't know if impossible is the word that you would use, but how difficult and disempowering it would be for you, because nobody there really is accountable either to themselves or secondarily to you to really do anything. Yeah,
so one of the ways that I gauge that, because if I go to leaders and I'm like, hey, is your organization healthy? They're like, yes. And then you're like, cool. And then you go in and you're blindsided. So one of the things I do is talk about pre-work and the fact that, like, if you're not willing to go beyond a one-off training, like once every 3 years, that's problematic. Also, though, even if we're going to do really intensive, let's say every month for 2 full days, etc., I will assign pre-work. And however the leaders respond to that is the indicator of their health. Because they might say like, oh yeah, no one's going to do that. And I'm like, okay. until they do it, we don't have much else to talk about, right? Or they're like, probably like half my people will be super excited, but then like a quarter will be super salty. I'll be like, great. What are you going to do about that? Because what you aren't going to do is bring me in like the stepmom who's regulating on all the house rules because you don't like that your teenagers are wilding out, right? Like that's not the life we're signing up for. So there has to be some real accountability that's modeled by the people who are having conversations with me.
I was thinking, do you have examples of organizations where you've come in and found like the roster? There's the right roster there. What does it look like for them to begin in some of these organizations? Just to put a narrative behind some of these concepts we've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've worked with organizations, for instance, who needed to hire like a senior leader. And so before we're jumping, and sometimes they're frantic also, right? Because especially like in the nonprofit sector, there's never enough resource and there's always too much to do. So you meet an organization that has a gaping hole, you have people who are filling that hole, and they're like, when can you bring someone, right? And so in those moments to be like, okay, we're going to slow down and we're going to talk about like, what are the top 3 things you need from this person? And when they list those things, saying, what is that grounded in? Like what's centered when you're prioritizing professional, for instance? What is centered when you're saying they need to have a ton of experience? Experience equals access, and access is always tied to privilege, right? So you have to be willing to say, like, what are we looking for and then why? And then look at the entire process. So what questions are you asking? What are the job descriptions structured like? What are the requirements and are they necessary? Sometimes you have to, for funder reasons or whatever, have degrees and things, but a lot of times you don't. So is the degree a requirement of what you believe is important, or is it actually reflected in the work? So it's all of those different conversations to say like, okay, what would it look like for us to prioritize equity? And then how would that change the entire process? So in some places, we've changed the process entirely. We've had like more collective input, not necessarily decision making. We've had different pit stops that look different, going with like the actual application of skill instead of just interviewing. Because some people are terrible at interviews, but legendary as staff members and team members, right? And so how do you broaden the way that people can communicate? Like, I know how to do this work and I care a lot about it. And then especially looking at like, you might sometimes find someone who is phenomenal in all the things you can't train, like work ethic and attitude and enjoyability. And they may know nothing about the field you're in. And so like, what trade-offs are you willing to have? Someone who does damage in the community but is very experienced, or someone who you need to train for the next 18 months but is a rock star, right? And so the whole way walking them through the process. And that's one piece that I'm really different in consulting. I always say like consulting is not the right word, but it's the frame of reference people have. Because a lot of times in consulting there's this like, I'll come in and be like, here you go, Corey, here you go, here are my recommendations, good luck, you know, and then it's out. But I really believe, because again, I'm so fundamentally tied to the collective, I believe we have to walk through this together. And so it really is about like, we're going to be thought partners until you tell me that you're good. And even then you can call me and in a second I'll be there, because we are in it together. So each organization I work with, I need them to be successful in order to lift the collective.
But there have to be some organizations that you don't work with. And I'm just thinking about like this tension between like, say, nonprofits. Like, for example, I'm associated with 2 nonprofits. Interfaith Works, I'm also a minister for an interfaith community here in Olympia, which is, you know, nonprofit, right?
Do you ever sleep?
Yes, I do. Sometimes lightly. But, you know, so what I'm getting at here is that both of these organizations are well-intentioned organizations, and both of them have actually endeavored into doing work, and both of them are scarce on time and resources too.
Absolutely.
So I'm just thinking for a person like you who has these gifts and this passion too, to want to offer this kind of justice-based work, when you come into an organization, there have to be this, like, I'm guessing there's this balance between there's intention here part of the roster, maybe, if you will. There hasn't been a lot of time or resources. And, I'm wondering how you balance that too, because it's not every organization that has that intention has yet ventured deeply into the work to say, this is what we've done,
Absolutely. So first and foremost, I think the ones who have intention and not yet resource aren't talking to me. So
they're not talking to you.
No, because they understand fundamentally how I show up in the work, right?
Okay.
So I think they know, like, we're not going to have a conversation in which they're like, it'd be super nice, but we have this dollar, because I'm like, I have a good friend, Mo Young. She does nonprofit work up north, and she always says your budget is a moral document, right? So it's reflecting what your values are. And so even if you were to come to me and say, we have no resources for this right now, and in the next 18 months we want to spend 20% of our budget on it, that's work I can do. And if you want to meet me with like, yeah, we don't have money though, so are you good doing this for free?
Yeah.
Then that's a different conversation.
Yeah.
All of those conversations will happen, but most people don't come to me unless they're ready to hear about themselves. And people in that space normally don't want to hear it, right? So there is a need for this work everywhere, and people have to push past the intention, because I think a lot of people, especially white folks, get to walk through life understanding their intentions are enough. And once intentions meet the rubber in the road, there's this real humbling factor of like, I don't know what this looks like. And that's the moment when people are calling me. And so I think it takes a moment of saying like, we have no clue how to do it, and we're willing to do what it takes.
Yeah. I have a little section, a little prompt here called After the Book Club. If you can imagine what I might be getting at with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So after the book club, we've read, White Fragility. We've read, so you want to talk about race. Over the past year plus, maybe, and I'm summarizing this experience that I'm well aware of throughout numerous congregations here in Olympia, especially maybe in the wake of the murder of George Floyd.
Absolutely.
So some of these congregations have begun to feel an agitation and a connection to this work, and have sought and have gone to the Amazon or hopefully Orca Books or whatever local place, bought the book, and they did the thing, they did the discussion guide, and they might feel we are getting ready for ... And I have been discerning some of that ... in my own community. I'll hold my reflection on that for a second, but I just wanted to paint that picture for you, the after the book club picture.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then I'll let you go from there, and then maybe ask another follow-up question on it.
Absolutely. So I think a few things are critical. One, that those conversations about the book club topics are happening in communities with people that care about us enough to tell us about ourselves and that see things differently. We inherently don't do that, right? There's this like oscillation between like diversity, and I'll celebrate diversity because like all of us are different, and then we have like a cultural food night and we're like, oh, this is what you ate when you were a kid, that's magical, and then it ends. So there's this like differences here and we're celebrating it, but very surface. Or there's this like valuation of assimilation in which like all of us being the same is the ultimate. Inside of this gray area is the space to say like, I fundamentally don't agree with you, and it might be on something high stakes. I'm not talking about like whether or not Black Lives Matter, because that's fundamental and that's like a deal breaker, but I'm talking about like political affiliation or faith walk or any of those things. And if we can't spend time in space with people who don't agree with us and might not agree with us after we have our little like soapbox moment, then we're not being challenged on things we're not seeing. Because your bestie might be like, yes, girl, that's amazing, and it's like, of course you think that, we're like-minded. And so it's important to be in spaces and consume information that's not harmful, but it is contrary to how you believe, so that you can round out your perspective. So I think that's one.
That's one, yeah.
The other piece is really about saying, like, what am I doing? Like, so reading a book is phenomenal. That's like so good as a fundamental step. It's like pre-work. But like,
Pre-work,
how do you apply that directly? And so one of the things I do when I'm training a group, for instance, is I work very specifically on doing theory to practice so that people understand the why behind it and also the applications of it. And at the end of each session, when we go on breaks or whatever, we talk about like, what's one thing you're going to do in the next 30 days, the next 2 weeks, the next week? How are you going to take this information and roll it out, right? And it doesn't matter what it looks like. It might be like, I'm going to talk to my parents about this. I'm going to, like, you know, talk to my partner about it. I'm going to go through my closet and get rid of things. Whatever the thing is, it's really about saying, like, there is an expectation that we will grow and evolve in every single day. And part of that is action. Just like if you have a prayer life that's dope, you understand fundamentally that your higher power works through the action that comes from what you're driven and motivated to do, right? It's not like, dear God or higher power or Allah or universe, please heal me, and then you just like sit and wait. There's doing, right? You go to the doctor's appointments, you take the medication. And so there's some real grappling and accountability that needs to happen around saying, like, what will you do, right? And until we normalize that, not the finding of solutions, not the fixing, but the doing, then I think it's challenging for people to actually bring about any real change. Because if we're talking about chore charts, there's action happening by reading the book. So it's really about, like, how do you tangibly move the knowledge that you bring? You take it from knowledge to wisdom, right? And as we move to wisdom, that's when the real action happens.
It's like almost developing like a muscle memory, you know, like
Absolutely.
doing something, you know, getting in the habit of not having the prompt of the book, or even the inspiration, which I believe happens, you
Absolutely.
know, having it not stop in this feeling, but
Totally.
but practicing some kind of action.
Yeah, because that diligence is how we make things happen, right? Like, if you think about fitness, everyone wants to, like, change their lives, lose all the weight January 1, right? And then how many people, statistically even, like February 1, are still doing it because the motivation has left, right?
Do you
I'm
know?
no longer
Do
inspired.
you know that number?
I'm not sure. Peter,
Okay.
do you know?
Is that,
It's probably
It's low?
very, very low.
Okay.
27% is my guess.
we need stats on book club
Totally.
feeling to action.
Totally.
That's what we need now.
Totally. So it's that moment, though, of saying, like, I'm going to become a person who does fitness, and that is different than someone who works out because they feel like it's a really good idea. And so it's the same. Like, how do I become a person who does equity? How do I become a person who centers it as a fundamental part of who I am as a person? And I think there's a moment where you have to recognize, if you're raised in a white supremacist system that promotes patriarchy as a vehicle to do that, most of the things that you're going to do to bring about change won't make sense to you, and it shouldn't. And so when people are telling you, hey, think about this, and you're like, that doesn't reconcile, I think those are the moments to really sit with what you're hearing, to say, like, oh, if I'm trying to disrupt the system, then the tools that built the system are not going to inherently break it down, right? So thinking about that is fundamental.
Yeah, if you wanted to kind of say what have my studios. Your message. What you're just talking about, I've been reading the 50th anniversary edition of James Cone, A Black Theology of Liberation. He is talking about love and wrath. Wrath being like a sense of righteousness or doing,
Right.
you know, and that many white communities, I don't think he was using white supremacist language per se in the book at the time, 1970.
Right.
But if we can now, in some communities that are white supremacist religious, there is a lifting up of this attribute of love.
Yep.
And Cone is saying, when you devoid the spiritual experience of the wrath, the righteousness, you've negated the fullness of being.
Absolutely. And I think the same thing is done around privilege and oppression, to both detriments, right? So, like, I can talk about, like, I'm being oppressed, and people are like, okay, well, stop victimizing yourself, and, like, let's do toxic positivity, and, like, what can you control, and all of that, when it's like, no, that's directly on the flip side of the coin of privilege, right? So we have to talk about privilege in order to talk about oppression. And the other side is true too. When we're talking about privilege, we're not talking about white folks walking through the world as royalty, which is why the conundrum of privilege is so rich, because people are like, how am I so privileged if I have poverty, right? And it's like, yes, that's real. And there are factors that you don't have to think about even inside of that experience. And so I think understanding fundamentally that those two go together is critical. Same with love and wrath. Absolutely. Because you can't have the totality of any one thing without understanding the shadow side of that, right? And I think part of the challenge is like the love as a solution to all things is incomplete, because it again paints the ideal sides without having to talk about the ugliness, right?
Yeah, it does.
And so it's like, well, just love people, and you're like, I love everyone, and then you're like, cool, I don't need to do anything else, like I can check that off. It's like book club, check. Love everyone, check. But love is action. Love is literally going into the streets and doing. You know, like people are always like, you know, Jesus loves everyone, that's what I do. I'm like, Jesus also flipped tables when he saw things that were outrageous. When he was like, you're not doing right by people, he went in on people, right? And so it's like, let's tell the full story of what it looks like from any lens.
We forgot in your bio, pastor's kid.
Pastor's kid, that's right.
So add that to the bottom.
Exactly.
We mentioned that yesterday. So they're
PK all day.
PK all day. There's an author, John O'Donohue, Celtic poet and writer. He's got a slightly softer perspective on the love wrath, and he talks about the creative tension in community. And I think in our conversation today, collective and community can be a little bit, together in the same basket. And I think a lot of times community or collective can feel like just the creative part. But the creative tension is his phrase for it. And I think about that, and I try to honor that even as a leader in spiritual community, I try to think of what is my obligation toward creative tension, not just tension, but creative tension.
I like that. And
when it comes to social justice work that I'm trying to learn and grow my own head and heart around, I'm asking myself, where's the tension edge, and so I'm appreciating you naming this like repetition of action, after something lands.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think two things. One, with brain science, our brain literally creates tension points when we're trying to change something, because our brain thinks in patterns. And so our brain thrives when things are predictable. It's kind of why like anxiety works. It's an overcorrection of that, because it's like, that person's walking towards me. I've been here before. And so it's like, be afraid, because the last time someone walked towards you, it didn't go well, right? And so our brain is like, wait a minute. So if you're walking towards someone and you're like, hey buddy, and you start running, your brain will be like, is this really what you want to do? And it creates literal friction so that everything in your body can be like, oh, actually, I don't want to do that. And you stop and turn around and run or whatever. So number one, brain science provides that tension you're talking about because it's inherently in our DNA. I think the other part to understand is like, we can't grow without being uncomfortable, because literally growth is changing the current condition to something else. And so there's this real element that I talk about all the time of understanding, if you and I are in conversation and you walk away totally comfortable and you were never challenged, what you need to understand is that I didn't not generate discomfort, I just didn't transfer it. So it always exists.
I didn't not generate discomfort. I just then you said I got
no, you're like the double negative.
Yeah, can you do it again?
So discomfort always exists.
Yeah.
If you understand fundamentally there is no new thing, then you understand that in every dynamic, discomfort exists. So if you go into a dynamic and then you leave and you were never uncomfortable,
I can relate to that.
Doesn't mean it wasn't there. It just means you never carried it.
It means I never carried it. I never chose to participate in it.
Right. Or got access to it or noticed it or any of those things. So one of the fatal flaws in all of this work for white folks specifically is they understand, they go into a conversation and then they're like, whoa, I'm getting uncomfortable. And so they're like, stop it. But what you have to understand is the discomfort existed the whole time. I'm asking you to carry it with me. And if we're really going to do this as a collective, if we're really going to have each other's back and do this together, that means the weight I'm carrying, you get to carry some of. And so literally it means like, if you don't have a smudge of discomfort somewhere, it means you weren't touching anything. And so like, what does it mean for you to literally do the work of lifting it? Not carrying me, not carrying my part, but to say like, I understand fundamentally that there is discomfort right now, and I'm going to take my equal part because it's important. It's critical. And then if you're in a relationship where you're like, actually, I'm tired of you being uncomfortable, I'm going to carry it all. That's a different dynamic.
It's different, yeah.
But if you're not uncomfortable in this work, you're not doing work. You just aren't. Because fundamentally, there is discomfort every day.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for letting me ask you about that.
No, you're good.
Because you were getting going. I was like, I don't want to miss it. The train was getting...
You're like, wait.
Yeah.
It happens to me all the time.
And I was thinking back about our conversation about love, and we were talking about love. So oftentimes I think, especially in maybe happy white communities, like love and compassion become, they become the same thing. But like that word compassion is like to suffer with.
Exactly.
And so what wound can I feel? And until I do feel a wound, compassion isn't necessarily occurring.
Correct.
Something else was happening.
Absolutely. There's a scholar, Jeff Duncan Andrade. I talk about him all the time because he's like literally my hero. And he talks about how white folks cannot do this work effectively if they don't have proximity to the pain.
Yeah.
And it's, again, the understanding of not like, oh, I read in an article one time that people were like unhappy, but it's like, no, I've seen the suffering firsthand. And it like, I mean, inside of faith communities, it's about like break my heart for what breaks yours, right? There's this real principle of saying like, what does it look like for me to like take that on, understanding if you're suffering, I'm suffering, instead of like, I'm so sorry to hear about your suffering. Thoughts and prayers, right? And it's like, that doesn't do shit for me. It really doesn't. And so like, what does it look like for you to like really stand in it with me? Because that's where solidarity is built, right?
Yeah. Who is that scholar you referenced?
Jeff Duncan Andrade. He is
contemporary.
Dope. Yeah, he's down in California, and he's done a lot of work inside of K-12 schools, specifically like Black and brown serving institutions. And he is powerful, super powerful.
Nice. Because when I saw Brian Stevenson speak maybe 7-8 years ago, and the very first thing on his list of 5 things in order to bring yourself towards more racial justice work was getting proximate.
Yeah, it's critical.
It's the first thing he talked about. Sounds like
critical.
It's on the mind of this person as well. And yeah,
absolutely.
Well, Sarah, as we start to round out our conversation, I wanted to ask about hope.
Yeah.
And ask you, if you want to, say what you think it is, because I don't want to assume that hope is the same thing for any person. And where you see it or feel it around about you in the world.
I think hope is the audacious belief that better is possible, to a point where you can like see it and taste it and touch it. And I think it's in everything that I do because it has to be. Like, if I didn't have an outrageous sense of hope in all spaces, I wouldn't do what I do, because it's agonizing. It's hard. It is emotional labor every day. And there are days where I engage fully in spaces where I'm like, this is going to go, it's going to be challenging, but we're going to be climbing up the mountain. And then I spend an entire day sliding down the mountain or standing on my feet, watching other people quit and walk away. And so it's really important to understand, like, I hold hope for all things. I think people can fundamentally become the best versions of themselves in any given moment. Even if you have a track record of, for a very long time, being a very terrible human being and stewarding your relationships horribly, I still believe fundamentally that you could decide in this second right now, because we have power of choice, because turning points happen all the time, and because life is a game of inches. And so in order to progress towards any type of real change, you have to hold hope. And if you don't, then it's monotony. And if you want monotony without hope, you might as well just, like, I don't know, do something super boring but not meaningful, right? And so I think, you talked yesterday about the theme that you had seen in leaders is that they could see this other world, right? And they're like fighting for that. And I was like, that's exactly what it is. Like, I can see it, I can taste it, I can smell it, I can like touch it sometimes. And so it's hard because at times I'm like, what are you doing? Like, we can see the thing and not everyone can see it. And I believe I was put on this earth to share what I can see so clearly with other people so that we can move forward together.
Thank you for that. Yeah. And then a totally unrelated question.
Yeah.
Going back to the preacher's kid.
Yes, PK.
Have you ever preached before?
No, never. I never have. It would be inspirational, though, don't you think?
I do.
Yes.
Yeah, I do.
So maybe today will be the day. What is it? May 11th,
yeah.
2021, where my life switched and changed trajectory. So if ever that happens, you're invited for sure.
Well, if I can help bring that forth in any way, but
Yes.
the word hope is, it's a loaded word, and I've encountered communities. I used to work with incarcerated communities a lot, and hope was like a nourishment, and yet I've found really interestingly that the farther I go into like privileged communities, the more people like intellectualize it and want to take a disassociated view on hope as if it's sort of like a sugar totally. Ingredient.
It's too woo-woo.
Yeah, so I'm just and I don't have a thesis here, but I'm just curious about the the relationship with hope and suffering and how those two might energize and relate to each other.
Well, yeah, because I think, when you have privilege, you don't need hope to exist. You just have the assumption, right? Like, you go into spaces and there's like affirmation of existence always. Like, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine. They're super privileged in all the ways. And I was talking about some example of something where I was like in an environment and just without anyone talking, they were like, we don't want you here. I could just feel it. Oh. And I was talking about how like that's pretty much a given everywhere I go. And I was like, when's the last time that happened for you? And
Did you ask them that?
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
Said, okay.
Oh, absolutely.
And then what?
And they were like, never. And I was like, never in your life. And they were like, not that I can think of. And I'm like, that's wild. Because it happens dozens of times an hour for me, right? And so there's this existence that whiteness allows inside of this structure where you don't need to hope things go well because they do. And if they don't go well, it can be naturally attributed to like one of two things, like that person didn't like you or it wasn't meant. But also the loss of opportunity creates this belief that it's like, we were talking about that same person about like, what if you didn't get a job or something? They're like, another one would come. I'm like, even that assumption is so wild to me, right? So there's just this assumption. You don't need an audacious belief that things will go well, which is hope for me, because they just do. And if it doesn't, it's situational. It's not a function of a larger system. So I think you only need hope when you're suffering, because part of the hope is understanding that the suffering can end.
Maybe a way that I could work with hope more in privileged communities is to try to weave in like responsibility. Maybe getting back to that collective, maybe that could energize hope in some of those communities more.
Because I think fundamentally, if you understand like every terrible day I have, that's your terrible day also, then you have hope on my behalf until you really start to embody the fact that it actually is you and I in the same thing, right? So that's why proximity is so important. Not because like, we need to burst bubbles or anything, but it is about saying like, I really hope you win. And then I hope you win again. And then you're like, actually, I hope we win, because you can become a we when you have proximity.
I love that. We can become a we when we have proximity. That's a good last. Yeah,
Pastor Dr. Sarah Lloyd for you.
This final segment, this co-facilitated sermon in the last.
There you go.
Here, so I might have to circle back with you on the preaching bit. So
yes, that's awesome.
I'm just kind of curious about that. Thank you so much,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Sarah Lloyd. Great
Absolutely.
to be with you today. Thanks for joining us. We will begin to conclude now this Lean in Olympia episode. It's been so good to be with y'all. Again, my name is Corey Passons. I'm with Interfaith Works. Lean in Olympia airs twice a month on Tuesdays. I got caught up on this bi-weekly thing last time too. Totally, but please check out our website and our Facebook page to stay up to date on what we're doing. And peace be with all of you. Great to be with you.
Bye. Bye.